In this episode of A More Beautiful Life Collective podcast, we are starting a new series on what does it mean to create a life you love and cultivate your heart for God. This is something that we end every podcast episode with, this phrase, and so we really want to unpack what that means. And so we're going to start with the first part of that phrase, which is what does it mean to create a life you love? But before we even begin to answer that question, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is if we even should. Is it biblical to want to create a life you love? What does the Bible even say about this idea of creating a life you love and about the idea of pleasure in general? We're going to look at some history and then turn our thoughts to some elements of theology to figure out the answer to this. So I hope you'll join me on this episode of A More Beautiful Life Collective podcast. Welcome to A More Beautiful Life Collective podcast. We know that in the hectic hurry of everyday life, it's easy to lose sight of what really matters. This is a moment to pause and realign your focus on the one who gives us peace and rest. We're focusing on discipleship, productivity, and homemaking as we live with eternity in mind. This is the place where you'll learn to create a life you love and cultivate your heart for God. I'm Casey Fletcher. Thanks so much for joining me. Hey everyone, I'm your host Casey Fletcher, and today on the podcast, we are talking about the phrase that I end every podcast with, which is, I hope that you create a life you love and cultivate your heart for God. For me, this is like the purpose statement of this podcast, to try to figure out what does it mean to create a life that we love living, a life that's good for us, a life that's intentional and filled with good habits, and then also how does living that life help us live better for God? So as we think of these things, I want to unpack what these phrases mean and make sure that we understand them biblically so that everybody's on the same page. This is episode 7 of season 2 of A More Beautiful Life Collective podcast. And as we look at this, we are going to alternate between our systematic theology episodes that we've been doing. So next week, we'll pick up with that one on the doctrine of sin. And then we'll also have these more practical episodes that look more at our life today. So today we are going to be talking about the phrase, creating a life you love. But the question we have to ask ourselves is it even biblical to want to create a life that you love? What does that mean? How does living a life that you love help you to cultivate your heart for God? I hope that this series helps you to catch the vision of what this podcast is for and really take the tagline of this podcast to heart. As we look at what we're going to answer today, we're going to look at some ways to approach pleasure and pain and discomfort. And then the next episode is going to talk about what creating a life you love actually looks at, some practical steps. So the first thing that we have to ask ourselves is, should we even try to create a life you love? Sometimes whenever I say that at the end of the podcast, I think of, different responses. I've actually heard in a podcast before, it's like, God doesn't want you to create a life you love now. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, it's like, well, why doesn't God want this? And as I was doing some research for this podcast, I came across the following exchange. So the question that sparked the discussion, this was on Reddit, was, does the Bible endorse or prohibit enjoying things and indulging the goodness of life? Like, what's the line between enjoying life and loving the world? One of the thread of responses read as follows. So the first person said, this is a good question from the OP. I was often surprised by the Christian who wants nothing to do with the world. I'm not surprised anymore, but it just seems depressing. Like they can't find any enjoyment or they don't have any friends that are not Christian. It's usually the same for believers who think the world's going to end at any possible moment. Been like this for the past 20 years and maybe even longer. It has been longer. There's been people saying that like forever. I thoroughly can't believe these believers are bringing many people to Christ. I mean, enjoy life, love people, and meet people, have fun. That's how we bring people to the Lord. But somebody responded, but shouldn't we live like Jesus could come back at any second? Plus, we don't know our time. We could die at any second and stand before God to be accountable for our actions. Paul said we should not be yoked together with unbelievers, which includes close friends. And there are dangers in having non-Christian friends. And 1 John says, love not the world or anything in the world. Jesus said, deny yourself and take up the cross and follow me. The biblical Christian life is hating the world, right? And so I think really this exchange kind of describes the tension in the Christian life, where one, like you want to have life and have it abundantly. But then also we have all of these verses that talk about denying yourself, taking up your cross, to hate the world, to live is gain, or to live is Christ and to die is gain. Like, how do we rectify these things? If we are enjoying life now, are we going against God? Are we going against what Christ says? I think, there's really a kind of push in Christian culture to have this like martyrdom mentality, where the more that we feel like we suffer, the better that we feel about our lives. And I read this in books, it's kind of caricatured in books that you read. There's a book called Middlemarch that talks about this, and this idea of somebody like wanting to sacrifice themselves for God, but in doing it, they kind of sacrifice themselves in a way that is just kind of silly. And then they live this whole life of, an unhappy marriage and all these things because they wanted to have this like martyred mentality. And we still see this today, where people feel like if they're suffering, they must be doing something right because Jesus said that we're going to have suffering in this world. And so I think there's this tension where Jesus said, okay, you're going to have suffering in this world. So if you're creating a life you love now, are you going against what the Bible says? Matthew 16, verse 24, it says, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul?" I think we recognize from those verses that sacrifice and self-denial are just part and parcel of the Christian faith. And I think if you listen to, what we've been talking about on the podcast, you'll be able to see that, right? We talk about this sacrifice and self-denial of changing our desires and making sure that we're practicing an intentional faith that glorifies God. And so that means that there are certain things that we do not pursue. But we have to ask the question, is it really Christ-like that we create a life we love? Or is this something that is like a false kind of prosperity gospel? What does the Bible say about pleasure? Is pleasure evil? Is it bad? What should we do? This is the question that we're going to be answering today. And I think the best way to look at this is to look at the history of it. I mentioned that in the last podcast, that I think a great way to understand what we should believe about something is kind of look at the beginning and kind of trace threads of how that thing is developed over time. And so the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, what is pleasure? A simple dictionary definition of it is just that feeling of happy satisfaction and enjoyment. I think if we wanted to create a life we love now, that would be saying that we want to have elements of pleasure and happiness in our life, satisfaction and enjoyment in our life. And we're going to try to look through and understand the whole philosophy of pleasure, which really there is. If you look over time, this has been a topic that's repeatedly brought up over time. And so we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So some thinkers view that pleasure is just the absence of pain, while some view certain actions as like positive pleasure and certain as negative pleasure. Some reframe certain types of pleasures as base, while other types of pleasures are more virtuous. So again, there's all these ways of creating happiness, but people kind of put them in certain boxes of this is an acceptable way to get happiness, this is not. And so as we look at all of this, I think we have to understand that in our modern society, we have a very skewed understanding of pleasure. I think that we should have pleasure in our lives, but the pleasure that the world says we should pursue is very different than the pleasure that the Bible says is okay to pursue. And so there is a certain, group of type of thought called Christian hedonism, which John Piper, he wrote a book called Desiring God, and he kind of came up with this term. But this Christian hedonism is, I think, the way that we should approach an answer to this question. And we'll get to that at the end of this podcast. So first, let's look back. And we're going to start with the Greek views of pleasure. And I think the reason why is because you don't enter Christianity in a vacuum. And so obviously there were Hebraic ideas. So in like the Old Testament, they're going to have certain ideas that they believed. But I think a lot of Christianity, we get a lot of influence from Greek thought, especially Plato, who was studied over and over again for thousands of years. And so if we want to understand what the Bible says about pleasure, we also have to recognize that we have preconceived notions of what pleasure is that's not based on the Bible. We bring our own culture to the text, and we repeat what we hear the culture say as we kind of interpret the text. So Christianity, it has thousands of years of history, and part of that history was influenced very much by Greek culture and thought and philosophy. So Christianity today is kind of viewed as like a dull and boring religion, right? So we are kind of viewed as, full of moralistic rules that bar you from self-actualization, from living out your true self, your true identity, and for having fun. And so we have to think, okay, well, why? Why is this the way that people view Christianity? How was this view created? Different cultures and movements had different competing views on the pleasures of life. So the ancient Greeks had a very nuanced view of pleasure. Socrates argued that the pleasures that result from pursuing virtue and knowledge are of a higher quality than the pleasures resulting from satisfying mere animal desires. Pleasure is not the goal of existence, however, rather an integral aspect of the exercise of virtue in a fully human life. Which honestly, I agree with all that. The best pleasure is not made from enjoying the basic things of the world. Instead, it comes from an enlightened state of mind when you are gazing at what is truly good, true, and beautiful. So Socrates had this view. Now, his view was contrasted against a couple other Greek ideas at the time. So you had the Stoics and the Epicureans. Stoicism claimed that living justly and virtuously was the highest good that one could experience, and that pleasure and pain are to be treated indifferently. I think we could think of this as some of like the Eastern religions kind of have the same idea. While the Epicureans, instead of treating things indifferently, they said that we should seek to maximize our own pleasure by removing pain from our lives. So pleasure, as Epicurus regarded it, was the beginning and end of a blessed life. So Socrates kind of birthed these two groups, among other things, because he's like the father of philosophy. And so you had the Stoics and the Epicureans, but you could see how they were very different in their mentality. I think the tension that we feel in Christianity between enjoying life and loving the world, it was felt by the Stoics and the Epicureans as well. One of these, the Stoics said, okay, pleasure is just not worth it at all. And we just want to live as good and righteous as we can. And any kind of pleasure, pain, anything like that, we don't even try to feel it. And I think a lot of Christians today think that's how we're supposed to approach pain and pleasure. We're supposed to approach it in a kind of Stoic way. But I think we view culture as saying, okay, they're like Epicureans, right? Where they just want as much pleasure as possible. Then in the church age, which I'm saying the church age is the Catholic Church age, so basically from the late Roman Empire to around, the Reformation, Christianity, it went through a transition period where it was moving from being a Jewish faith to transitioning their mindset into the new covenant. And Gentile Christians who had all of these ideas that we just talked about, they began to influence the thought in the church. I think Greek ideals, it reigned supreme in Roman culture. And so, the early church, they underwent this kind of synthesis of Jewish ideas and Greek ideas. And it created this Judeo-Christian culture that still influences us today. I think one of the ways that this came into fruition in the church was with this idea of asceticism. So the ascetics ideas were not really based on the Bible. They were derived from Gnostic thought and philosophy, which, the Gnostics, they were kind of like the bad guys in the early church that Paul was constantly arguing with. Kyle Hughes states, particularly under the influence of Cynic and Gnostic ideas, some Christians in the tradition of the Gospel of Thomas believed asceticism to be not for the sake of an extraordinary mission, but because the world itself corrupts and kills. So, like the Greeks had this idea that the body was kind of this corrupting influence, and the whole goal was to be released from the body and be able to go to the afterlife. The Gnostics also believed this. And so the idea of asceticism was it was like Stoicism on steroids. So everything that could cause pleasure, you don't want to feel, because in doing so, the world corrupts and kills. And so we don't want to experience anything that is of the world at all. And so I think we get this idea most blatantly in, kind of the rule of life that we read in a lot of the monasteries. So the fact that they only drank, water was always deemed the drink of choice instead of wine or beer, that they didn't want to have any kind of choice food. They just wanted to have bread, that they dressed kind of drab clothes. And the only thing that was ever, beautiful was the pictures and things in the church. And that changed over time. They also, restricted, eating, sleeping, drinking, and obviously having sex. And so this self-denial wasn't really seen in the scriptures. Like, yes, Jesus, there were certain, like he was not married, but he was called a glutton and a drunkard by some of his critics. And so he was definitely going out and feasting with the people he was around. He wasn't saying, oh, yeah, this is good for you to try to limit every kind of rich food or anything like that. Like that, for him, that was not what it meant to deny the world and take up your cross. One of the things that I think is important to recognize is that the ultimate reward for the Christian life is described repeatedly in the parables as a marriage feast, which is including all three of the pleasures of marriage, eating, and drinking. So I think that, we see this skewed picture of what it means to be a good Christian kind of pop up now in the Middle Ages, where they really they prize the self-denial that even could be harmful to your health. They say that Catherine of Aragon, who was Henry VIII's first wife, she was so devoted to fasting that's why they think that she lost so many babies. She had several children, but she lost almost all of them except for Mary I, because of miscarriage and stillbirths and infant deaths. And they say that one of the reasons why that happened was because she fasted so much throughout all of her pregnancies, because she wanted to observe lots of fast dates and things for the church because she was so devout. So where does that leave us today? So we talked about, these Greek ideas that existed before Jesus's time, and then we talked about how they kind of got mixed with a couple other ideas during the church age. And then in this like modern secular time, like how do we view pleasure? Where does that leave us today? I think most of us we don't understand the context of the Middle Ages. Most of us would probably question the last time that we fasted ourselves, much less to have somebody in power, where they're literally harming their bodies because they're fasting so much. So we've moved from a culture that esteems the values of the Stoics to a culture, like I said, that's a little bit more Epicurean in nature. And interestingly, I found an article that talked about how Karl Marx liked the idea of the Epicureans. And he wrote his doctoral thesis on this school of thought. It says in an article about this, it said, ultimately, Marx wanted to shift society to create a culture where pleasure is more evenly distributed. And that means less work and more hedonism. This outlook still holds value today. Marx stressed that the lifestyle that comes from miserable workers engaging in repetitive work of mass production is hardly geared towards happiness. So as we look at some of these, thinkers that kind of heralded in this secular age, so thinking about Marx and Freud and other philosophers, they really prize this idea of devoting your life to pleasure, or this Epicurean idea. And we don't call them Epicureans, but we call them secular humanists, like we talked about in the last episode. An article from Authentic Intimacy says, our culture worships the self. The idolatry of the modern age is humanism. It's all about you. Live your best life. You do you. Secular humanism teaches that truth is found by looking inward and connecting with your authentic self. We are so accustomed to thinking like this that we don't even recognize that this is a form of idolatry. So secular humanism is basically this mode of thought that is non-religious, and it prizes empiricism, evidence-based decision-making, and ethically minded scientific research. That's what a secular humanist says that it prizes. So morality is framed as something that doesn't cause unnecessary pain. And as Epicurus said, for the secular humanist, one of the chief goals of man is to alleviate pain with pleasure. So anything that brings pleasure is a moral good, and anything that brings pain or being uncomfortable even is a moral evil. Authentic intimacy goes on to say, friend, let's not forget that the most seductive idolatry is that which maintains a thread of truth. While it may have all the trappings of what seems true, self-love theology is rooted in lies. The lie is that you're inherently good. You could save yourself through positive thinking. You are powerful and in control of your destiny, and you deserve to have all of your dreams come true. So again, I think what people have done is because they say that humans are so good, they say that anything that brings you more happiness or more pleasure is good. But we have to start to, if you don't recognize the ethical problems in that, you have to think about questions like, well, what if something that brings you pleasure brings somebody else pain? What do you do then? It's like the abortion question. If you think about, it's like the fact that something that could bring you happiness and satisfaction and contentment in your life, because you don't have to deal with the fact that you have a baby, is something that's harming and killing a baby. What is the ethical answer in this? Now, because the baby doesn't have a voice, people say, of course, if it's something that harms you. NPR did a whole series on people who had an abortion that didn't regret it, and they thought it was a good thing for their life. And so that was deemed as a moral good for them. But again, that's that secular humanist idea where they view anything that brings pleasure a moral good. But we recognize that we're not good in and of ourselves, and that the thing that brings ultimate goodness to our life doesn't really have anything to do with pleasure or pain. It's all to do with Jesus. So where does that leave us? Okay, so we trace kind of this development of thought over time, where you can kind of see how, because of Christian ideas, it got carried on through the Puritans and brought here through Protestant ideas. And so we have this asceticism associated with Christianity, where Christianity becomes these things that you don't do. So we even have this with, the Baptists of the last century, where they don't drink, they don't dance, and you have the movies like Footloose. That is something that is kind of this stoic idea of Christianity. And then you also have secular humanism, which is a very Epicurean idea. So where does that leave us? What does the Bible say about pleasure? How is it biblical to want to create a life you love now? John Piper writes about this in his book, Desiring God, Meditations of a Christian Hedonist. And basically what he says is we recognize that our lives in the kingdom will be better than what we could ever imagine. So our redeemed lives in the next age will be better than anything that we could possibly want. And we also recognize that this world is terribly broken, but even so, we enjoy life now. The best summation of Christian hedonism is that God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in Him. So when we enjoy God, we enjoy life. When we find satisfaction in God, we find satisfaction in life. And the opposite is true. When we enjoy life, we enjoy God. And when we find satisfaction in life, we find satisfaction in God. So there's this symbiotic relationship between God and the enjoyment that we get out of life, the ability that we have to create a life we love now. When God comes first, the things will follow. There are several verses that talk about this relationship between delighting in God and delighting in His world. Psalm 37:4 says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart." Ecclesiastes talks about this, and the whole book kind of goes through this tension of enjoying the world now and also making sure that God is your first focus in life. Ecclesiastes 2:24 says, "There's nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen is from the hand of God." Ecclesiastes 8:15 says, "So I commend the enjoyment of life, because there is nothing better for a person under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Then joy will accompany them in the toil of all their days of the life God has given them under the sun. Psalm 16:11 says, "You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." And 1 Timothy 6:17 says, "As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God who richly provides us with everything to enjoy." So from these verses, we see that one, when God created the world, he created it very good. And so we have good things in the world, good things that God has given us. But we often choose to mess around with lesser things instead of finding the enjoyment of the greatest things in our lives. On the positive side, pleasure comes from God. He gives us every good gift. And if we look to him for good things, we're going to be rewarded now or in the future age. Piper writes that C.S. Lewis, he was hearkening back to C.S. Lewis, who has this really great quote. Lewis says, "No, your desires are not the problem. The weakness of your desires are the problem. You're like a child fooling about in slums with your mud pies because you can't imagine what a holiday at the sea is like. In other words, your desires for the great things that God is offering you are way too small. Your problem is not big desires, but small desires for big things." So I think the first thing that we have to figure out is, what are we desiring? What are we choosing to delight in? If we want to create a life we love, we have to choose to first delight in God above all else. And in doing so, the lesser desires will fall into place. I think we have to recognize that there is this dark side of hedonism. And it's this kind of this happiness and gluttony trap that modern culture has fallen into. We've talked about before how like technology can create this like zombie-like addiction where you don't even want the thing, but you keep being pulled to it because of the dopamine reaction in your brain, which is how addiction works in any sense. There's just this dopamine reaction. So if we look at what the Bible says about this, we have to recognize that if we're seeking pleasure for pleasure's sake, if the only thing that you care about is creating a life where you feel happy, then you are going to experience pain and suffering. It's like it's the opposite of what you would think. So in Ecclesiastes 2:1, it says, "I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure, enjoy yourself. But behold, this was also a vanity." In Proverbs 21:17, it says, "Whoever loves pleasure will be a poor man. He who loves wine and oil will not be rich." Luke 8:14 says, "And as for what fell among the thorns, they are those who hear. But as they go on their way, they are choked by the cares and riches and pleasures of this life, and their fruit does not mature." 2 Timothy 3:1-5 says, "But understand this, in the last days there will come times of difficulty. For people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness, but denying its power. Avoid such people." And 1 Corinthians 10:23 says, "All things are permitted, but not all things are of benefit." So we really have to be intentional about what is of benefit to our lives. If we look through all of these verses, we see that if somebody is seeking after pleasure for pleasure's sake, it ends up choking out their love for God, and they start to have all of these other vices and sins kind of pop up in their life, and their good fruit does not mature. And so we want to make sure that we're choosing what good things we want to follow that are done for our benefit. If something is a detriment to our lives, we should flee from those things. So, one of the things that is very obvious is like if you are, hardcore drugs, if you look at that, yes, it might give you pleasure. I've heard that it's like people who, are on heroin or whatever, it takes 3 years for them to experience the type of pleasure that they have with anything else in life. Like they don't feel joy for 3 years after they get off the drug. So obviously we recognize that if you're on heroin, like you're on the path to death, like that's just what happens. And so if you are pursuing something like that is obviously detrimental to yourself, and you're doing it for the sake of pleasure, like you need to remove yourself from that thing. But also anything that you're doing in excess just for the sake of pleasure, whether that's, eating with like gluttony, eating, drinking, even things like sex. If we are choosing those things just for the sake of that pleasure, and because of that, we are allowing our fruitfulness for God to be choked out, then we're going to be on the path of death. And so that's the dark side of this hedonism. Again, if you're creating a life you love now, just so that you feel happiness now, and that you feel that pleasure now, then it's going to be something that ultimately will lead to death. Just like it says, whoever loves pleasure will be a poor man. If you're just seeking after pleasure and you're not willing to do the hard work of self-control and self-discipline, then you're not going to see the fruit of your labor. The foolish person seeks after pleasure to the detriment of their relationship with God. Pleasures for pleasure's sake leads to a decaying in your relationship with God. You become that which you love. We have a risk of becoming like our idols when we are seeking after them. And we really want to toss those idols aside. So if we're loving pleasure over God, then we've succumbed to our idols. We have to order our loves rightly so that we're pursuing what is best. So in sum, what does the Bible say about pleasure? And is it biblical to create a life you love? Well, I think the answer to that is yes, it's biblical to create a life you love, but the biblical answer to that is creating a life you love requires you to put God first. You have to put God as your first love, your first desire, and then all of these other things will fall into place. Pleasure itself is not bad, and God will give you the pleasures of your heart if you delight in Him first. But whenever you seek after the pleasures of this world with no honor given or no remembrance of God, then that is where you're going to fall into troubles and difficulties. And so in 2 weeks, the next time that we pick back up with this, I want us, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at how you create a life you love now. So again, if the idea is that you create a life you love, and we recognize that it is biblical to create a life you love, well, then we have to think about, well, how do we order our loves rightly? And what are some of the things that we should be pursuing? There's a phrase that's common in Christian circles that says, part of God giving you the desires of your heart is that the desires of your heart are changed whenever you have a thriving, deep relationship with God, so that you're not seeking after things that are sinful. And so what are those actual things? Like, what should your heart be desiring if you are desiring after the things that God wants for you? And that is what we're going to talk about in the next podcast. So next week, we're going to be looking at the doctrine of sin. And then the week after that, I'm going to be giving you some practical tips to create a life you love now. You can check out our resources on the shop if you would like to start cultivating your heart for God and creating a life you love now. There's Bible studies and other types of things that help you to create these habits and goals to help you to live the life that you want to live for God. So I hope you'll join me next week. Until then, keep creating a life you love and cultivating your heart for God. Bye.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of a More Beautiful Life Collective podcast. If you haven't yet, please leave a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts to help others find the show. While you're there, you can like and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Don't forget to check out the blog and our store for more encouragement and resources on how to create a life you love and cultivate your heart for God. I'm Casey Fletcher, and I'll see you next week.